Hello and welcome to Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers.
By writers.
To keep you writing.
I'm Marshall.
I'm Shingai.
I'm Sameem.
And I'm Will.
And I'm excited to be hanging out with Sameem and Shingai this time around to finish up our Canon series, our creative research, whatever we're calling it. Round of applause to all of us.
Have y'all gotten ululations on the podcast yet?
No, I'll take it though. But what I love about this, if you have not listened to our other ones, is we get to sit down with a couple of our co-hosts and talk about the writing that influenced the reason that we write and why we continue to write and what got us into telling stories kind of overall. So I'm going to run this one. I'm going to throw questions at Sameem and Shingai. Will's going to jump in as he does. But I'm really excited. I'm really excited for this. Honestly, I haven't got to sit down with you guys in a while, so I'm stoked. So welcome back, I guess, with me. That doesn't make any sense, but we'll run with it.
It's actually more like you haven't been on any of our episodes yet with the East Coast crew. This
No,
will be
I
the
haven't.
first time.
No, but you've
I'm
heard
excited.
all of them and
Yeah.
edited our shows.
And
I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard them all, 100%.
And made them good.
Yeah.
All right, guys. So you guys know how this works. You have works kind of prepared. So I'm excited. So I'm going to start off with my first question, and feel free to kind of move your list around according to what I ask. But let's start with the first one. So the first one is, and I'm going to go back and forth. So we'll start with Shingai, and then I'm going to go to Sameem, and we'll kind of bounce back and forth. But the first question is, why consider your first work or the first work you're going to talk about, and why were you drawn to this work in the first place, and why is this one on your list at all?
I think because it fundamentally changed the way I write or grew the way that I write. And it did that by giving me a lot of permission. And the way the story was written. And I think that I hadn't seen that before. So that was really cool to witness. Should I say what book it was?
Yeah, I was just going to say, tell
Okay,
us what
cool.
the book is and what it's about and what's going on. We were
Okay,
all ready.
So the book that I'm thinking about, the first book on my list is Augustown. And I've given this book a lot of flowers. It's in the acknowledgements on the back of my novella. It is by Kei Miller, who is a Caribbean author. And I came across it the first time during my MFA program. And it is a fantastical retelling of a history of a town called Augustown in Jamaica. And it's rooted in a lot of gossip as alternative truth, which is a theme that I have been playing around with and thinking a lot about in my own work, especially after reading that. And one of the big things that it gave me permission to do was to write how my people speak. And yeah, I'm very grateful for that book.
Nice. So same question to you, Sameem. And then the other thing I didn't mention before you go, I'm sorry, is if any of the other questions, if you ever want to come back to any of these other works and throw that in there, you totally feel free. It's just kind of a fluid thing. But so Sameem, why is the first book you're going to talk about on your list? Why did it make the list?
I think something Shingai just said really resonated with me. And I think it's sort of the reason why these books are on the list. It's really hard to come up with just 4 and narrow it down.
Yep.
But I think these are the 4 that I think gave me the most permission to write, and sort of like kicked me in the ass, and pushed me to write as well at the same time. But it both did that, but also took things that I was holding back on and said, no, you can go forward and say what you want to say. And so I think this is true of all of them. But I think just because it's the first one I wrote down, I'll mention Parable of the Sower. I think
I love that book.
There were a lot of things in it that resonated with me in so many different ways. So I could talk for hours about it and simultaneously feel like I don't have anything to say. But I think the permission it gave me in particular was one, like listening to myself and the way that I perceive the world and the way I see others perceiving the world and being sensitive to it, even if it's reactions that I don't see anyone else have, especially I think if they're reactions that I don't see anyone else have. And I think was very true of like Butler writing this book, but also the main character in the book. And I think it, I don't know, it was just like very encouraging to go out and say the things that I wanted to say and feel comfortable saying them without sort of too much concern about whether or not they made sense to anyone else.
So Shingai said that she came across her work in her MFA. What drew you to, why did you pick up Parable of the Sower?
So I think I was introduced to Butler maybe like a little bit more than a decade ago through a coworker who I think I was just like rambling and sort of daydreaming a little bit at work about how I wish I could do something creative with my life and how I'm trying to get more serious about my interest in science fiction. And I hadn't figured this out at that point. I was just like working my first job out of college, not in the creative industry at all. And I had a coworker who was like, I really miss this guy. He's like an older, wiser sage. And he looked me up and down and was like, this kid has no idea what he's talking about. And he's like, you need to go read Kindred. And I went and like, obviously my head exploded. Cause I think one of the things that kept me, and this might be a little bit of a tangent, but one of the things that kept me, and I think a lot of us from taking seriously our writing was, especially in science fiction, was just never seeing anyone who looked like us in the field for the types of things that I was exposed to from a science fiction perspective. And not having been able to find things outside of like classic science fiction written by old white men. And this was like, I think first a kick in the ass for me to like take more seriously that there's stuff out there. So I read it, loved it, made a list, and then took me a couple years to like sort of get back to more of her work. And I think I picked up Parable of the Sower again, like a few years later when I was sort of trying to get back into the headspace of writing after like life took its tangents. Started it, then moved. I was in Seattle at the time, moved to San Francisco, picked it up again. And I think like the same week I picked it up was my first experience in wildfire season in California. I think it was like October 2017. And then I just like devoured the book because like I totally then understood what she was talking about way more than like 20 years earlier. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I think just like the curiosity of a different perspective that I hadn't gotten before.
No, it totally answers the question. Will?
I loved it that you picked an Octavia Butler because that was one of my picks, not Parable of the Sower though. I guess my question for Shingai and Sameem is there's like this reoccurring notion of it gave you permission or you saw a part of yourself in the story. So for Shingai, previously that book when you discovered it in your MFA program, you talked about how like it gave you permission to write how, your people spoke. Was that the first book that you saw that done, or was that the first book that you really felt resonated, that was like, wow, the nuance of the language really hit you?
That's a good question. First of all, I also really love that you picked Parable of the Sower, Sameem, because that was also going to be on my list. And then I changed my mind at the last second. So shout out to that. And to answer your question, Will, I think it definitely wasn't the first book where I saw that. I think it was a moment in time where I was able to feel it. And I think because of I was learning a lot about writing and writing outside of the white gaze, as Toni Morrison would put it. And writing outside of the Western canon and what that looks like, and how that can sound lyrically on the page. And Augustown was able to do that at the same time that I was learning about it. I saw it in practice. So I think that's why it struck me so hard. Yeah. I think that's what got me. And the nuance, the language is beautiful. I highly recommend the book. And also the way the story is told is like the practice of circular storytelling, which I think I also enact in my own writing. It's the way that the people that I grew up around told stories. Where it's not linear. It's not beginning, middle, end. It's like all over the place, and it's you find the connections. And if you're neurospicy, you also understand this because that's how we work. Yeah, but I loved that.
That's awesome. Now, Sameem, like, just to dig a little bit deeper, like, when you talk about Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, you're like, people like me, and that people looked at the world the same way. What struck you about that book that made you like really be like, I found someone who sees me? What was it in that story that was just really like it hit home?
Yeah, I don't know if it was that I found someone who sees me, rather than felt like it gave me permission to be seen, if that makes sense, in my writing.
Yep.
It felt very distinct and special to me. I don't know. I think like, yeah, I don't know. I'm drawing a blank on like what else I could say about that.
No, that's fine. Shingai.
So one of the things that's interesting about Parable of the Sower, and there's a question here for you, Sameem, is that like the first time that I read it, I struggled with getting through it. And then years later, I picked it up again, and it was exactly what I needed to read. And I'm wondering about your experience with reading it, and whether there's something that one of my students a while ago told me about how some books teach you how to read them. And I feel like Parable of the Sower is kind of like that, because it's unlike so many other books in the field. Yeah, was it hard for you? Like, how did it become meaningful? What was the journey?
Yeah. I mean, I think like, I don't remember the exact year I picked it up the first time, but there was like, I picked it up at first and maybe read a few chapters, and I don't think I like disliked it, but I put it down. I didn't go back to it. And I think, it had more to do with me and where I was.
Yeah.
And I don't remember where I was the first time I picked it up, but I was definitely living in Seattle. And I don't think I was conscious when I like picked it up again a few months after moving to California that, I was sort of following the journey of the book. I wasn't in Southern California, but I was getting a little bit closer than Seattle. So I don't think that's why I was like, hey, I should go back to this book. I think it was more of, I had been in California for 2-3 months. I was sort of like, my daughter had just turned a year, so I'd like gotten the hang of parenting for the most part. I was in a job that was like very steady, and I'd like sort of figured it out. And I felt pretty calm and steady and stable in my like real life, and then felt ready to pick it up. And I don't think this was conscious, but I think that's like why I ended up sticking with it, was I could maybe like take in more of what it was saying. And maybe I wasn't in the right place for it when I picked it up the first time. Because I think I'm trying to remember. I mean, it's been like almost 7, I guess, years since I read it. And I haven't like picked it up again front to back. But I think there were things about the perspective that are like very, very close, that can maybe be like a little bit jarring if you're not prepared for it the first time you pick it up, at least for me. But I think I need to go through it and read it again, and see how I feel now, years later.
I find it really interesting that you guys had a similar experience of picking it up and putting it back down. I actually think I did that 2 or 3 times. I think I was working at a bookstore in Santa Cruz at the time when I found there was a version of it there, and I just sat, because at a bookstore you can read at work. And so for some reason it hit me. I don't know what it was. It was just, I think it's a timing thing. I don't know. That's really interesting that it's one of those books. It feels like you have to be, I don't know, ready for it. I don't even know if that makes sense, but
it is that.
Yeah,
it is.
That. Yeah.
It's a heavy book.
It is.
And I think it deals with a lot of stuff that was happening then, and then it was in the future. And then if you're reading it, especially since Psycho Pants Trump took office in 2016, it was even more.
Well, that's why I didn't read the sequel, because it was like 2017 when I looked at the description of the sequel. I was like, I can't do this right now.
Can't do it.
Yeah. So I'm going to give that one some time.
We just might be back to it.
Yeah.
But no, I do think I'm remembering a little bit now. I think it's like fairly early in the book where I think she has to like shoot a dog. And I might be getting this a little bit wrong, but like she feels it. And I think that was a lot. And I was like, I don't think I can read this. I didn't know this was the book I was getting into.
Right.
And I'd read Kindred. I hadn't read a lot of her short fiction. Don't think I had seen, although there's some of it in Kindred, a lot of like the blood that she can write about. And I'm like a queasy person. So I think that might be the other reason why I put it down now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Octavia Butler is not queasy.
Definitely not.
I love that. Okay, so I thank you. Let's move on to the next work. And I want to focus on craft. And now Shingai brought this up a minute ago, talking about circular storytelling. If I'm not right, is that what you said? So think about one of the next works on your list if you want to go in order and challenge yourself, whatever works, but I can't control that. But I'm going to focus on craft elements. So what do you admire of their next work on your list? What craft elements do you admire and or use because of the work, this next work on your list? And we're going to start with Sameem this time.
I think I'll talk about She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks by Marlene Nourbse Phillips. It's a poem, and it's probably a bad idea for me to try to reach back, because I think it's literally been 20 years since I originally discovered it and was fascinated by it. But I was revisiting it a little bit yesterday as I was thinking about this list. And I think this one in particular, I mean, there's a lot of themes that really pushed me to be more thoughtful about my own writing over the years. But the structure, it's a poem, so it has more space, I think, to be more playful with even just the physical structure of where words are on the page. But it also just goes from free verse poetry to a mock excerpt of a plant, or a planting book, book on plants, botany book. There it is. To I don't know, just putting words across the page in different ways. And then also using, and this is one of those things that I was like, whatever, that's interesting, but I have to write my final paper on it. And at midnight was working on it, and ended up being up until 4 a.m, not because I had to, but because I became so fascinated by what she was doing in some areas. And it's one of those things where I'm I probably should have switched my major at this moment, but didn't listen to myself. But there's just the use of words that I found really fascinating, where she very subtly uses 2 different definitions across for the same word, and secondary definitions that I wouldn't even think about existed. and it just reminded me to be more thoughtful about the root of my craft is the word. And I don't think about that often. And that there's so much history in every single word. And this poem in particular is about losing your mother tongue and having it being torn away from you, and losing your history as a result. And so I think just the way that she used the craft and like the way the words are laid out on the page and like the gaps between words to like exemplify that was really fascinating for me.
Wow. Shingai? Same question. Craft elements that you admire or use to this day because of the work on your list.
I resonate with a lot of what Sameem said, especially when it comes to poetry and the poetic element. I think I'm thinking specifically about two books on my list: The Salt Eaters by Toni, Cade, Bambara, and The Dragonfly Sea by Yvonne, Owuor. Both of those books, one of the things that you said, Sameem, made me think about poetry as play. And what I love about those books is that they use poetry as play. Like the sentences sound really fun and like it's a game. And I have a friend who's a poet who talks a lot about how every word feels like it's reaching back for the word before it. So it's like a game of tag of like, and coming back to circular storytelling, like even down to the sentence, like it's always a conversation between the words themselves. And then the other thing that I really appreciate about both of those books is it feels like every character is just as important as every other character. And I think that is a craft decision, because in The Salt Eaters, which is Toni, Cade, Bambara, I went through a phase of just like being obsessed with who she is as a person. She has this quote that's pretty famous. The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. The role of the writer. And when she writes her stories, there is a protagonist and there are the people around the protagonist. And it feels like you're getting insight into every one of their stories. And you are realizing that like they are a whole protagonist, who you are allowed to interact with, even though it's not focused on them. And I think that that's a rejection of exceptionalism in the writing and the work itself, which I deeply appreciate.
Follow up or anything, Will?
I mean,
should we have Shingai commit to one of them for that one? Because
I'm going to concentrate on The Salt Eaters for this question.
Let's do that. Yeah,
because I've read that book, and it's interesting to hear you say that this is part of your canon, because now I can completely see it. Especially like how you talk about political revolutions, and when we've had conversations, not just like online, but afterwards, we've talked a lot about imagining a better world that isn't like capitalist, that isn't just about I do this for you, you do this for me, in a way that's tit for tat. Like you really talk about a lot about building, a fairer, truer future. And I can see just from that book of like your influence and how you go. I just can see your brain like working from that book, which I think is really beautiful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So the reason I said that before, Shingai, is because you mentioned one of the authors specifically and how you followed their work. Was that, am I wrong? Is that the Salt Eaters author?
Yes.
Okay. So maybe I'm not going to say you have to take that one off the table, but my next question is more author specific. Okay. So I'm curious, you can come back. I'm not saying you can't do anything. Cool. So is there something about, and we're going to start with you. Is there something about the next work on your list about that author that keeps informing your work as you continue to write? Something about that author specifically.
I think I'll actually pick a different author.
Cool.
Surprise, surprise.
Sorry, the teacher in me was like, okay, now no, I'm just kidding. Anyway, continue.
That's okay. I'm gonna pick Yvonne because she's a Kenyan author. So her work has given me permission in the specificity of we share a nationality, and she also refers to herself as a Swahili Seas citizen, which I now have had in my Twitter bio for a couple of years, because I feel like she thinks about storytelling from a cross borders lens, even though she's rooting it in specific places. She's also thinking about what is outside of those borders and how that interacts with what is inside the borders. And I think that that's been really important for me, especially when I'm thinking about my storytelling as cultural memory work. And when I'm thinking about it as how can I build the world that I want to live in, kind of what Will was talking about earlier, when I'm always talking about how we have the possibility to live in a different imagination outside of this capitalist society. Yes, so I'm grateful to Yvonne for doing that in her work, and also for naming what is wrong with the world that we are in. And she talks about Kenya specifically having 4 languages. Oh my goodness, I hope I remember. It's been a long time. Memory, something, and silence. I can't remember at this moment. Right. But I really appreciated her thinking about the language of silence, the things that people refuse to say, and how to use writing to say those things, to name those things that people don't know how to name.
I love that. All right, Sameem, so same question to you. Looking at the last 2 works, is there something specific about that author that keeps you, that informs your work?
This is hard. I think one of the works I have on the list is that I haven't spoken about yet is Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut. And I think it helps pull me back from monotony sometimes when I'm writing. I think especially as I'm trying to write my first novel and I'm so focused on a plot that makes sense. I think, and it's been a very long time, I think more than close to 20 years since I read Sirens of Titan. But I think it's so absurd. And what's happening. That's the main thing I remember about it, is how random and absurd it feels. And I think I have to keep reminding myself it's okay to this is fiction. It doesn't have to be completely real all the time. And so I think that's stuck with me. I think I don't write, at least at the moment, I'm not writing a lot that is Vonnegut-esque. But I think it's helpful to remind myself that I can be outlandish in bits and pieces here and there.
But I think something you both have been saying kind of throughout is, whether you're writing something that's fully absurd or not, you have the permission to do so if you want, because of the works you have consumed. And that's kind of why I like these conversations, is because, we are asked questions about our own work all the time, but I don't know why do we write the way we write, and why do we continue to write what we write? And I think a lot of it has to do with what we consume, and why we consume what we love is what I find myself saying that too much. Like I said, I repeat myself a lot at school, but we consume what we love. We keep coming back to the same kind of genres and stuff like that. And I think what you guys are saying is perfect. Will, any thoughts? No thoughts.
No thoughts right now.
Okay.
Just
I'm
vibes.
taking it all in. It's all vibes.
It's all vibes. I love it.
Also, I remembered the quote. It was the 3 languages are English, Swahili, and silence.
Nice. Perfect. All right. So you both have one work left on your list. I am this is going to get to the point to where we're going to talk more specifically about the works that you're working on and that you have worked on. But you have one more work left, and think about what you've written, published or not, doesn't matter. What wouldn't exist or would be completely different if you had not consumed that last book or poem or whatever it is on your list? It might be a tougher question. Actually, we're starting with Sameem this time. No pressure.
Well, I guess it's the only story left on the list. But yeah, I think the Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. I guess to take a little bit of a step back, I hated the idea of writing short stories for a very long time. And then I attended Worldcon for the first time, like back in 2018, and sat in on a panel about like the short fiction markets. And I didn't know that they existed at this point. It was like a whole new world for me. And it was a combination of a few authors and editors, it's like Scott and Sheila from Beneath Seas the Skies and Asimov's. I can't remember who else was on the panel. I think Chen Kifan was a writer. I can't remember the last person, but it was so refreshing to hear about the short story markets. And then for myself to go and read them. I think at this point I hadn't read a lot of contemporary fiction. And it was also at this con that I discovered LeVar Burton reads. And that sort of like blew my head open to. And that's where I first heard this story by Ken Liu. And I loved it for a lot of reasons. I think the first time I listened to it, I was driving and I almost had to pull the car over because I started crying towards the end. And I don't know if I thought it consciously or if it just came later, but at some point I was like, yeah, I want to make someone cry like this. And I think I was really fascinated that he was able to pull that off in a short story. And I don't know if that's like a universal feeling or if it's just because that story hit really hard for me personally. I think it was also, this is an unfair criticism of a lot of first generation literature from like Asian and South Asian sources that I've read. But I think a lot of it is very like self-pitying of like, oh, I had a hard time trying to merge these cultures together and deal with my parents' expectations and, you know, a new culture's expectations. And I vibe with a lot of that. But I think this story was refreshing because it was also a critique of that person, of like how entitled we often are. Some of us often are, myself included, and unappreciative, especially as we're growing up, and how there's like a lot of growth. And how for the character in the story in particular, like it was too late by the time he realized it, and he sort of had to come up with his own way to resolve that. And so I don't think I didn't write that in particular. I didn't write the resolution of it. But I think the story gave me a little bit of permission to write a bit about what I had been feeling and have a character who is like an entitled, self-pitying, immature jerk. And I think the main character of my story, Airbody, is is like self-indulgent, but like unambitious and doesn't really appreciate the people, particularly the women in his life who have like done a lot for him. And I don't know if this came across in the story. I think people really focused on like the auntie in the story and the feedback that I got. But for me, a lot of the story was about this just like immature late 20s, early 30s something spoiled guy who just didn't realize how unappreciative he was being about the world.
All right. Same question, Shingai. What work wouldn't exist or would be completely different if you had never consumed this last story on your list?
I think all of your work after you've consumed something is changed by the thing. That's a cop out. But also, since we talked about Parable of the Sower, all you touch, you change. Everything you change changes you. God is change. I will say the novella for sure. And This Is How to Stay Alive was also deeply influenced by my last book on the list, which is The Deep by Rivers Solomon. That book was very, very big on permission giving for me. I think especially in the ways that I was thinking about memory and who holds the memory of a people and what it does to the memory holders to hold the memory. And the second thing was also thinking about saviorism and like the individual having to save the community or like whoever they love, which is something that in my novella, which is about a sister who goes back in time to save her brother, it thinks through a lot. So I'm very grateful to how Rivers opened up for me what was possible when thinking about how to tell that story.
So we have a little time. I have a little wild card question I kind of came up with on the fly, but Will usually has questions on the fly too. What do you?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Marshall.
No, I'm just throwing it out there. If you have anything to follow up on that last one before we get to some other.
No, I'm still thinking.
So my question is this: you guys have 4 amazing works here, and I think sometimes the way that I phrase the questions, we don't get kind of the meat of some of the stories. So think about where you're at now and our lovely listeners. Why should I want you to pick one of the works and tell our listeners why they should read that book today? And I'm going to start with, actually, we got to go back the other way. So Shingai, you're up.
That's an impossible ask.
I was kind of hoping you would do that.
I really don't know what you want me to do with that.
Well, these works mean a lot to us, and I know I'm thinking back on my list, and like, yeah. I don't know, why would I tell somebody? Those are people that have listened to the episode where I was asked these questions or similar questions. Like, why would I recommend, a Dragonlance novel to somebody? I mean, why would I do that? But I don't know. For me, it's like, it kind of depends on where you're at. Sure. But like, there's got to be some reason that somebody should pick up one of these books on your list.
Okay. So this is with the disclaimer that on any given day, the answer about which book would be different. Mm-hmm.
Fair enough.
And there would probably be more than the ones on this list. I will say, because I don't think anyone, it might be rare, a rarer pick. The Dragonfly Sea by Yvonne Owuor is magnificent, and it is about the ocean, and it has so much beautiful imagery when thinking about the Indian Ocean. It is also historical, speculative, like I would call it Afro-surrealism. I don't know if Yvonne would. It blurs the line between reality and the metaphysical, and those are the types of stories that I just devour. The sentences sound like song. The relationships make you want to cuddle someone. It is a big book, but you will completely disappear into the world of the story while you are reading it. I should be paid to advertise it. I feel like I've done a great job.
That was a great job.
I'm literally about to buy this.
I'm like, so, okay, I'm writing that down. All right, Sameem, what do you think? Recommend one of these books and why someone that's listening to this show right now should read this work.
I feel like I lucked out a little bit because this is a little bit easy. Because Parable of the Sower takes place in 2024. So it's like you kind of just have to at this point. Not that that's the only reason to read it, but I think it's super, super relevant, despite being almost 30 years old now, or more than 30 years old. It's incredibly prescient and relevant right now. Not comforting at all. So if that's what you're looking for, don't read it. But I think there's a kind of hope in it, in that it's like, to like the quote Shingai just had, like, there's change is inevitable. I'm not going to try to redo the quote, but God is change. And there's two sides to that. There's always positive change as well. And so I think there are like glimmers of hope in it. And despite how dismal the world is, like, the character is pushing forward for their vision. And I think that's encouraging too.
It's funny, the more we talk about that, it makes me want to go back to it. I've got it on my shelf inside. Like, I just want to just pick it back up, and because it's been forever since I've read it too. And yeah, I from what I remember of it, it's relevant and people should read it.
A little
Will,
plug.
any thoughts?
I'm
Sorry,
actually going to be hosting a reading group for Parable of the Sower soon. So
Really? All right.
Yeah.
Is it online, Shingai?
It will be online. Yeah.
What date is it?
I will give you more information soon.
Awesome.
Yeah,
and then
when you
we'll
get
put
the
it on
info,
socials.
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
I was gonna say do that, but then when we get the info, I can throw it in the show notes after the fact too, and people can, depending on when they listen to it. So that's cool.
Amazing. All right, so I have a question for you both. When you think, what do all four of those works have in common in shaping you as a writer?
That's a good one.
And I will pick Sameem first.
That's good. He was up next.
Oh, that's good. I'm on top of it. My ADD's it's doing pretty good today.
I think this is a cop-out answer, but I think they don't have anything in common. Like, what they have in common is that I hadn't encountered anything like them before.
That is the commonality then.
Good. And I think that's why they resonated with me. And I think I'm not a good reader. Like, it takes me time to get into a book. I'm very slow. It's like a lot of energy consumed for me. So if I sit down, if I pick up a book and it's written in what my brain thinks is like a very conventional way, I'm not going to read it. I'll be like, oh, you can make a movie out of this, and it won't lose anything. But if I pick up a book and there's something interesting going on with the language and the form, and it's going to make me work to understand it, then I will sit with it. If it's like a little bit, just like the right amount of challenging, for like where my brain is at. And I think all these works did that in different ways, and found me in different places at the right time.
I love it. Shingai?
All these stories are about Black people just living.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a commonality. And I think they also deal with memory and imagination in ways that I find interesting.
The last question I usually ask with this series is, and it's been actually pretty fun in the Discord watching people throw in their stuff, their personal canon books. I've actually had conversations with people that have listened to the show that have been like, oh, this would be on my list for sure, and kind of tell me why, which is awesome. So I guess what I'm asking is, do you have advice for someone who's listening to this, or early writers that want to kind of dig back into their own creative canon and make this list? Like, when you were tasked with this, what was your thought process, and what should people be trying to focus in on, especially if they're trying to write, regardless of where they are in their career? If that makes any sense, I'm going to start with Shingai.
This is a great question, because this was hard. It's a hard thing to do. I think that one, canons should always be malleable, always be flexible, always be willing to change. I think that I picked books from a really long time ago and books from not that long ago that I still consider part of my personal canon, because this version of me as a writer has been influenced by those books, even though it's more recently. So just, I guess, remembering that your canon can be whatever you want it to be. And that's the beauty of imagination.
Sameem?
I think one thing that I always tell myself would be a really good idea to do both during and after I read a book is to like journal a bit about my thoughts on the book so that I can come back to it over time. I don't do that. So this was really, really hard. Because I couldn't remember. I could remember feeling that there's certain works that felt that like stuck with me, and it's more like the vibe of it stuck with me. But as you can tell from me trying to explain the answers on this podcast, like it's difficult for me to narrow it down with a lot of specificity, without going back into it and rereading it very deeply and then like psychoanalyzing myself for like where I was and what I was doing in my life at the time. So I think, journaling in general and reflecting on, the stuff that you consume. And it feels really silly because I'm saying be a thoughtful person is basically what I'm saying. And this will be easy. But I think also just giving yourself the permission to follow your curiosity and consume. I think the reason why like Sirens of Titan, for example, like resonated with me, I picked it up randomly at the library in like 2007 as I was wandering around. And I was in a really miserable place, and like nothing about like all my future plans sort of like had blown up, and I didn't know what I was doing in my life. And I picked up this book, and I think if I read it a few years later when like my life was back on track, I wouldn't have liked it. But I think because it was so absurd, it really like made me feel like I can make sense of where I am in life. It's not a big deal. And so those types of reflections, I think, are like really important to like understanding your own personal canon. And I don't think it always necessarily needs to influence your creative work or your writing, if it just resonated with you in some way.
Nice. Well, I gotta say, I love sitting down with you guys and having this conversation. And I'm gonna put all of your guys's books in the show notes and stuff like that for people who want to check it out. But I do encourage people to jump into the Discord too, and throw your personal canon out there and let us know what your process is. I think that'd be fun to do. Any other thoughts, team?
I love these episodes because I feel like you learn a lot about what people are reading. And if you haven't tried any of the books, it's a good way to be like, oh, I want to read that. I like what they had to say. Or, or you want to revisit something that you've read a long time ago that you haven't read. So this was great.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.